which we aim to lay before Parliament and to come into force by the summer recess this year.
Many thanks. And that concludes portfolio questions. And we now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 9844 in the name of Annabel Goldie on Scotland's future. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. And if you're ready, Ms Goldie, I call on you to speak to your motion and move it. Please, 14 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am delighted to open this debate for the Scottish Conservative Unionist Party and Scotland's future and her continued place within the United Kingdom. And today I want to proudly and passionately proclaim the merits, opportunities and advantages which that unique partnership of the United Kingdom offers to the family of nations in it, Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. It is a vibrant, dynamic and vivid example of how being together and working together with all our national diversity creates a richly interwoven United Kingdom which is greater than the sum of the parts. This enduring, extraordinary political, social and economic union enjoys support internationally and across different political parties. And I know that Labour and the Liberal Democrats value that union as passionately as I do, and I look forward to their contributions to this debate. But this union is all supported by people with no political views. And importantly, opinion polls consistently confirm that across Scotland, the majority of people support and want to stay in the United Kingdom. And the interesting question to pose is why? Why in 2014 is there such broad support for a structure which was conceived over 300 years ago? And to answer that, we need first to look at the what. What is this partnership? What does it enable Scotland to do? Well, like any partnership, it offers twin attractions. It lets us share talent, pool resource and maximise opportunity. In times of challenge, it spreads the burden of risk. Together, we were able to fight against and defeat Nazism. Together, we have fought against and continue to fight against terrorism. Together, we faced the searing challenge of global recession and bank failures. It is worth remembering that the UK Treasury had to find nearly £50 billion to bail out the banks, including Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland. It also had to provide guarantee measures equating to nearly £275 billion for the Royal Bank alone. Now, that's not being negative, that's actually a godsend. And if the 21st century is defined by any one characteristic, certainly.
Would the member not also agree that the US government also contributed to the bailout of both the Bank of Scotland and the Royal Bank of Scotland to the tune of £180 billion and £230 billion respectively in 2000?
Annabel Goldie.
I'm merely indicating the extent of Treasury support and pointing out that that's an important dimension of economic stability for the Union, which is the United Kingdom. Can I also point out, Deputy Presiding Officer, that in this global world in which we live, a world only as distant as your mobile phone or your iPad or your tablet, this is a world where being able to influence and have clout matters. Not to exercise some ancient imperial colonial control, but to be at the heart of international influence, policy direction and decision-making. To promote international security, global peace, protection of democratic freedoms, protection of the planet, to find trading partners, to secure investment, to support business and to create jobs. Our United Kingdom partnership lets us in Scotland do all of that. We are in the G7 and G8 groups. We are one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. We are a lead member of NATO. And we are one of the top 3 countries in the EU, along with France and Germany. In this global age, we need that global reach. And as part of the UK, we have it. And a separate Scotland cannot replicate that. Consider this, Deputy Presiding Officer. The UK employs 14,000 people in 267 embassies, high commissions, consulates and other offices in 154 countries and 12 overseas territories around the world. You can hardly move abroad without the reassuring sign of the Union Jack. I think that's a sad reflection of the gravity of this debate. The UK internationally is defending Scotch whisky against counterfeits, discriminatory or excessive taxation. The UK internationally is defending Scotch whisky against trade barriers and other restrictions. Scottish businesses benefit from the active support of UK trade and investments, 169 offices in over 100 countries. And last year alone, UK trade and investment helped nearly 2,000 Scottish businesses trade with other countries. So in a global world, we are plugged in where it matters. And a separate Scotland, however well intended, cannot create that scale of diplomatic presence. Now, very importantly in a global world, we also deliver to those less fortunate than us. Last year, the UK gave over £11.4 billion in international development spending, the world's second largest overseas development donor. And impressively, the Westminster Government has increased international development spending to 0.7% of GNI, the first G8 country to meet this target. And again, with the best will in the world, a separate Scotland cannot match that level of contribution. Now, in a global world, that United Kingdom presence and influence are what I want to be part of. It is immensely positive, very important, something to celebrate and something to be proud of. And in a separate Scotland, I wouldn't have it. Deputy Presiding Officer, I, for one, am not jacking in the Union Jack. Now, Presiding Officer, I have never regarded myself. Presiding Officer, I've never regarded myself, at least not for a very long time, as being in the van of youthful opinion. But like many colleagues in this Parliament, I have been visiting schools, taking part in debates. And the evidence coming through is that overwhelmingly young people in Scottish schools and universities support the United Kingdom. Why is that? Why is that? Well, I think to them the UK partnership is positive, it's relevant to Scotland, and in their world, the global world, it's a partnership with huge international significance. Let me just finish the point. It is simply that with a population of 5 million people, we are not going to be at these international top tables. So not only does Scotland lose out on that influence, but others will make these strategic global decisions.
I thank the member for giving way. She mentions young people's opinion. Would she also accept that young people are very enthusiastic about being in the European Union, and really that is a key way forward for Scotland and the UK?
Honourable Goldie.
I'm sure young people are very enthusiastic about a range of issues, Mr Mason, and at the moment we are in the EU, so they can be there if they so desire. Presiding Officer, I didn't, from the age of 11, grow up beside an ordnance factory and attend Greenock Academy watching a regular presence of naval activity in the Clyde without being acutely conscious of the significance of defence. And defence is inevitably linked to the global world which I've just been describing. The UK is a major presence in NATO. The UK has been one of the most professional armed forces in the world with a global reach. Mr Swinney.
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Ms Goldie for giving way. She said that she had grown up in the west of Scotland, and I wonder when in her speech she's going to refer to the enduring intergenerational poverty that the United Kingdom has presided over on our own backyard in the west of Scotland.
Honourable Goldie. Order.
Well, in fact, in the west of Scotland, Mr Swinney, I've been fortunate to see a very impressive economic transformation from industrial and traditional industries to the high-tech industries which arrived at Inverclyde at the end of the 20th century. On defence, Deputy Presiding Officer, Scottish regiments are an integrated part of the British Armed Forces, and at a time when the size of the UK Army is decreasing, Army numbers in Scotland will increase by roughly 800 people. Overall military personnel numbers in Scotland will increase to over 12,500, and that's the highest level since 2007. I want to make progress. I've been generous with my interventions. In the procurement area, defence for Scotland means thousands of defence jobs, jobs which are generally well-paid, skilled positions provided by a range of companies, from naval shipbuilders to specialised companies, expert in modern equipment technology. And let me anticipate interventions and talk about Trident. Nuclear weaponry is a hugely emotive and divisive issue, and I understand that. And I find it to be a very frightening capacity. And I want to see a world where such a lethal instrument of destruction is redundant and no longer necessary. But I believe that influence on the global stage is a place to achieve that. And I do think non-proliferation treaties are hugely important as part of that objective. No, I won't. The major international powers of which the United Kingdom is one have a capacity to drive forward that agenda. Now, I am clear beyond doubt you achieve that objective from a position of strength by negotiating multilateral nuclear disarmament. You do not influence a position of weakness with a unilateral approach. Removing Trident from the Clyde, indifferent to where it ends up, does nothing, absolutely nothing, to influence nuclear disarmament worldwide. Deputy Presiding Officer, for the moment, the UK Trident base at Faslane supports 6,500 jobs. That will rise to 8,200 by 2022. And of course, the Dumbartonshire economy is underpinned by that presence. The United Kingdom's strategic defence capability supports our global influence, enhances our national security and provides thousands of Scottish jobs. A separate Scotland with one naval base, one air force base and one armed brigade will have a fraction of the current UK capability, no capacity to influence global activity, nor be a leading presence in multilateral nuclear disarmament discussions. I want a strategic defence capability that can deliver on global influence, meaningfully enhance our national security and support thousands of Scottish jobs. I can only get that by being in the UK. Presiding Officer, on the domestic front, this United Kingdom partnership is multifaceted. It provides important benefits to the 60 million residents from our family of nations. With 800,000 Scots living elsewhere in the UK, the Scottish threads are a rich part of that tapestry. They still feel proudly Scottish, but also feel unquestioned members of that bigger family of nations. And that family allows freedom of movement for all its members, regardless of where they stay in the UK. Not just because there are no border checks, but because there is a universality of approach, a universal state pension, there is a universal welfare framework and a universal NHS entitlement. People who want to go and stay with relatives and friends anywhere in the UK know what these fundamental provisions are. And there is also, Presiding Officer, a common currency throughout the United Kingdom called the pound. Presiding Officer, if anything has caused tumult in this debate, it's this currency chaos surrounding an independent Scotland. Now, I like the pound, always have done. I never shared the First Minister's view that sterling was, and I quote, sinking like a stone, and I quote, a millstone round Scotland's neck. I also never shared the First Minister's passion for joining the euro. But I have always marvelled at the First Minister's adroitness in changing his mind. So I shouldn't have been surprised when, standing in his head, he rejected the euro and expressed such admiration for the pound that if we are independent, nothing less than a currency union with the rest of the UK will do. Unfortunately, such an arrangement is not under Mr Salmon's control. It will actually be down to what will then be a new foreign country, the rest of the UK, as to whether it is agreeable to that. And even Mr Salmon's head of his strategy unit, Colin Mackay, has admitted that the SNP cannot assert as a priori fact we can achieve a currency union within the UK. No thanks. He is a wise man because we can't. The politicians under whom such a decision will be made have said no. And interestingly, there is a comparison here. Recently, Mr Salmon went off to Europe, this week in fact, in a charm offensive to explain why an independent Scotland should be unconditionally welcomed with open arms by the other member states as a new member. And perhaps anticipating some unhelpful conditions of entry like joining the euro, he brought out his negotiating masterpiece. If the other member states didn't play ball, they'll not be allowed access to Scottish fishing waters, nor allowed access through them to Norway. So apparently, Presiding Officer, when he says something, it's not bluff, bluster and bullying, but when the rest of the United Kingdom says it, it is. Presiding Officer, people in Scotland like the pound, they value the pound and they want to keep it as our currency, and that can only be guaranteed by staying in the UK. A separate Scotland either has to join the euro or float a new currency. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, there are many aspects to this debate about Scotland's future. Colleagues and contributors across the Chamber who support Scotland remaining within the United Kingdom will want to highlight areas and issues of interest to them. I believe passionately and proudly in my country of Scotland, and I care about her future. I also believe passionately and with conviction that the United Kingdom is not some rigid, dusty abstract of constitutional law. It is a living, breathing, vibrant, flexible and dynamic partnership, a unique union of nations. And in a global world, it ensures Scotland is at the centre of influence and decision-making, maximises our ability to contribute to a positive world, maximises our opportunity to benefit from that world. And while I do not doubt the passion and conviction of those who desire independence, they cannot deliver the global influence which Scotland currently enjoys. They cannot provide the economic stability which we currently share, and they cannot guarantee the pound as our currency. They cannot tell us what the currency will be, and they cannot deliver the best future for Scotland. Presiding officer, only remaining within the United Kingdom can achieve that. Only a no vote will secure that future. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. I now call on Deputy First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and move Amendment 9844.3. Deputy First Minister, 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, there is a real irony at the heart of the Tory debate today that would actually be quite funny if it wasn't also serious. Here we have the Tories extolling the virtues of devolution, when everybody in here and everybody out there knows all too well that the Tories vigorously opposed devolution, and they did so using many of the same arguments we've just heard from Annabel Goldie today. Back in the last Scottish referendum, if we'd listened to the Tories, we'd have left health, education, justice and every single other power that this Parliament has in the hands of Westminster. The Tories were wrong in the last referendum, not just a wee bit wrong, but 100% comprehensively wrong. And yet, despite that, they expect people to believe them now when they say it's best to leave powers on the economy, taxation, our welfare state of all things, energy and defence in the hands of their friends at Westminster. Yes.
To the member. Will the member agree that it was a Tory-led government at Westminster in 2012 which delivered the Scotland Act, giving this Parliament even greater powers?
Nicola Sturgeon.
If Annabel Goldie thinks that the Scotland Act 2012 is great powers, then I think it tells all of us we can expect nothing from these parties when it comes to more powers in the event of a no vote. The truth of the matter is the Tories are as wrong in this referendum as they were in the last one. And the tragedy, if you're a Labour or a Lib Dem supporter, is only that this time the Tories have managed to dragoon the leadership of those parties into their no campaign as well. The reality, and one that I believe is obvious to decent Labour supporters, the length and breadth of our country, is this: the Tories are the living embodiment of the democratic case for Scotland being an independent country. Why should the party that in the last 4 general elections managed to win in order 0, 1, 1 and 1 seats in Scotland be in any position of government? The answer is they shouldn't. They have no democratic mandate to govern Scotland. Indeed, for half of the time since 1945, we've been governed by Westminster administrations with no mandate in Scotland, parties that have been comprehensively rejected by the people of this country. It is a democratic outrage. And you know, if we vote no in September, we've no guarantee that the same thing won't happen again in the general election next year, because whatever Labour says about the next election, they can't guarantee that we won't end up with another Tory government. Scotland has voted Labour only to end up with the Tories too often in the past to have the wool pulled over our eyes now. The only way to guarantee that we won't get another Tory government is to be independent.
Smith.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm grateful to the Deputy First Minister. As Annabel Goldie was speaking, the Deputy First Minister said this must make you awful uncomfortable. But the truth is that Annabel Goldie is as Scottish as I am and as Scottish as the Deputy First Minister is. Did the Deputy First Minister reject Annabel Goldie's mandate when she took her support to pass her budgets?
Goldie is as Scottish as I am, but it is Drew Smith's position that leads to the risk that we end up having Annabel Goldie's party governing Scotland, even although very few people in Scotland vote for them. You know, UK Labour is running a social media campaign right now that poses this statement: the idea of 5 more years of Tory rule makes me, and then it asks people to fill in the rest. Well, here's the answer that more and more Labour supporters are coming up with in Scotland. The idea of 5 more years of Tory rule makes me determined to vote yes in September. Presiding Officer, the second irony in this debate comes from Annabel Goldie's desperate attempt to paint a veneer of positivity over the Project Fear campaign. We're now told to vote no because the UK is a partnership of equals. The problem is that everything the No campaign has said and done over the past months has demonstrated the exact opposite of that. We've had dire threats of what will be done to us and what, according to them, we will lose if we dare to vote yes. The No campaign has made it clear, in their view, we've no right to any of the shared assets that we've contributed to and paid for. It will be Westminster and Westminster alone that calls the shots. That's not an equal partnership, but it has made it pretty clear to people in Scotland that the only way to get a true partnership of equals between the countries of these islands is to vote yes.
Mr Johnston.
Yes, I will.
I'm grateful. I agree with much of what the Deputy First Minister says, but doesn't she take heart a wee bit, as I do, from the tone of the Conservative motion today? Isn't it clear from the tone that they've opened this debate with that they no longer regard independence as an absurd impossibility to laugh at? They're increasingly clear that they're losing momentum, that they're losing the argument. They're increasingly rattled that the people of Scotland are ready to vote yes.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I agree wholeheartedly with Patrick Harvey. In fact, he pre-empts what I was about to come on to in my remarks. You see, Presiding Officer, there are many reasons that I think the No campaign is in deep trouble and the Yes campaign is gaining ground. But I want to focus on three of them today. Firstly, people are not daft. That's something that the No campaign didn't ever seem to factor in to their calculations. They see through the scaremongering and they don't take kindly to the threats. Above all, people know that the ties that matter between our nations of family, culture, history don't depend on Westminster. They will endure regardless of how we are governed. We only have to listen to the words of the President of independent Ireland when he made his state visit to the UK a few weeks ago. This is what he said. Our nations share a unique proximity. We also share a common narrative woven through the manifold connections between our people and our heritage. Words that demonstrate, through the example of independent Ireland, that political independence and a strong, enduring social union go hand in hand. People also know now that the No campaign's position on currency is bluff and bluster. We've not just had the unnamed minister. We've got a report today describing it as confused logic, inadequate economics and subterfuge to frighten the Scottish people. No's currency bluff, no, I'm going to make progress. No's currency bluff has been blown. It is in tatters. And the question being asked now is, if people can't believe No on currency, as they can't, then why on earth should they believe them on anything else? The second reason, though, that No is in trouble is that people know we need independence to put ourselves in the driving seat of our own decision-making, to end the situation where we're at the mercy of decisions taken by governments we don't support. It's only by voting yes that we can make sure we don't get saddled with governments we've rejected. It's only by voting yes that we can secure our place in Europe and escape the risk of being taken out of Europe against our will by the UKIP-driven politics of the Westminster parties. It's only by voting yes that we'll get new powers for this Parliament, and it is only by voting yes that we can stop the dismantling of our welfare state. I had to check that I wasn't seeing things when I read the Labour amendment today. The Labour amendment talks about pooling, sharing and redistributing resources. And when you read stuff like that, you have to ask yourself if the Scottish Labour leadership is living on the same planet, let alone the same country, as the rest of us. If Labour really thinks that £6 billion of cuts to social security, 100,000 more kids being pushed into poverty and a 400%, not just now, rise in demand for food banks represents redistribution, then they really have taken a very wrong turn somewhere. The fact is, the best way, the only way to protect the institutions we care about, what could be described as the best of British institutions, is to get the power to decide for ourselves what happens to them. We've proved that with the NHS. We now need independence to protect the welfare state too. And can I say to Annabel Goldie, I'd much rather have an end to child poverty than a seat on the UN Security Council or weapons of mass destruction any day of the week. But the third reason, not just now, I'm running out of time.
Deputy First Minister, you're in your final minute.
The third reason the Yes campaign is gaining ground is this. The more people hear the doom-mongers say that we can't, the more the people of this country will say loudly and clearly, yes, we can. We're the 14th richest country in the world. We are blessed with natural resources. We have world-class universities and industries. There is no doubt we can be independent, and the more the No campaign questions that, the more they insult our intelligence and damage their own credibility. The question in this debate is not, are we rich enough or strong enough to be independent? The answer to that question is an emphatic yes. The real question is how we use our wealth as a country to create the kind of economy and society that we can all be proud of. How we build a country where kids don't grow up in poverty,
the member's closing.
while billions are spent on nuclear weapons. A country that can protect things that matter, like our NHS and our welfare state. A country that is confident, positive, outward-looking, welcoming, can-do. One that takes responsibilities for our own future and isn't driven by the politics of Nigel Farage and UKIP.
I'm afraid you must close.
That is capable of being a successful, progressive, socially just, prosperous, independent country. The only way to secure any of that is to vote yes, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I'm afraid I must indicate that going over time at this stage will take time off backbench speeches. I now call on Drew Smith to speak to and move Amendment 9844.2, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland joined a union with our nearest neighbours 3 centuries ago, and a lot has changed since then, not least the advent of democracy, of devolution and of a much more closely integrated world. On this side, we believe that Scotland can continue to enjoy the best of both worlds. Scotland has a strong Scottish Parliament, created by Labour, and which Labour is committed to both defending and enhancing. And the truth is that separation is not a development of devolution. It would be a decision to end it. Because devolution rejects the nationalist premise that decisions taken in Edinburgh are always good and decisions in London always bad. Yeah. Labour knows that good decisions are taken when the best argument wins out. Progressive politics, Presiding Officer, is not a function of our nationality. It is born of a movement for change. I can be proud of the achievements of this place and still believe in working together with like-minded people who happen to be Welsh, English or from Northern Ireland. Partnership in a union, however, also means more than that. The Scottish National Party's current prospectus for independence is predicated on the idea that every interest group in the country can keep the things they like about Britain and jettison anything that they don't. Yeah. And when it comes to sharing a currency with our neighbours, I don't believe that Scotland can simply tell others what is in their interests. If, as I hope they will, people in Scotland exercise their choice in favour of partnership with the rest of the UK, then let us be represented in it. In a few weeks, Europe will vote for a multinational parliament sitting in Brussels and Strasbourg, and the SNP are keen to stress their support for working together with other Europeans, even at the same time that they are seeking to leave the UK. I agree that we should be part of Europe, and therefore I think we should be represented there too. But when it comes to Britain, the SNP...
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, does he feel that the present Westminster government is enthusiastic enough about Europe, or does he not agree that we should be a little bit more enthusiastic with our neighbours?
Drew Smith.
Position is consistent. I believe in working together in the UK and I believe in working together in Europe. But when it comes to Britain, the SNP tell us that they want to share in the UK's institutions, but at the same time stop sending Scots men and women as our representatives in those institutions. And the only logic that takes you to such a position is nationalism. And that's why we've had what I think is a telling insight into the nationalism that drives this government this week. The First Minister's, albeit qualified admiration for President Putin of Russia, as we are told...
Order, Mr Johnson.
In the SNP's estimation, President Putin has restored national pride, and so the First Minister says that can only be a good thing. Well, Labour rejects that notion in this debate, just as we have rejected such sentiments throughout our history. The amendment we have put before Parliament today makes clear that our case for the UK is based on a clear positive vision for working together with others. Britain is not somehow unique amongst all the countries of the world incapable of political change. We reject the lumping together of Tony Benn and Margaret Thatcher as giants of something called and dismissed as the Westminster system, of campaigners against the bedroom tax here in Scotland and those in England as being motivated by widely differing values. And this is the fundamental problem with nationalism, is it not? Political differences about how best to order and reorder our society are reduced to side issues in this debate which Scotland is currently having. Unlikely alliances and curious bedfellows are not an accident of such a debate. They are the very nature of it. No, thank you, Mr MacDonald. This week we hear that Brian Souter has opened his chequebook for a Yes campaign which also has Tommy Sheridan as one of its most outspoken supporters. And we're told we can have Scandinavian services on tax and taxes. That's the offer in the White Paper. No, thank you, Mr Harvey. And that's why the motion before us is correct to highlight the inconsistencies of the Scottish Government and the unanswerable questions with which real people are left. Because since the publication of the White Paper, we've seen a collapse of a childcare policy, which was never much more than a slogan anyway, downward revisions of oil forecasts, threats to turn off the lights in England, default on debts, and this week it's blockade of our fishing grounds and excuses on the living wage instead of action. Because when it comes to talk, the SNP will say anything, absolutely anything, Presiding Officer. Scotland can be in Europe when it likes, on whatever terms it likes. We can withdraw our representation from the UK, but still dictate currency arrangements to our neighbours. Shipyard workers whose jobs are reliant upon UK defence contracts should be satisfied with promises of work that won't be kept. Pensioners should ignore the threats to their savings. The government's amendment lays it all out. Policy promises for bigger benefits and smaller taxes, and none of it requires price tags. This is the government which delayed action on the bedroom tax and continually postpones a credible report from its own welfare reform working group. As this debate has gone on, the Yes campaign has had to deny its nationalism ever more frequently. But what we've heard from the Deputy First Minister today is nothing new. It's the same old litany of negative nationalism, poverty used as a prop for constitutional politics rather than a challenge for those with power now. Boasts of Scotland's wealth, which we should take to ourselves, but no mention of how it would be redistributed amongst Scots, never mind the effect on others across the UK. Labour rejects the politics of nationalism because we refuse to give up on our neighbours or to give in to the despair which this government seeks to ferment. So Labour will continue to make our positive case for partnership and for cooperation, pooling and sharing resources, facing risks together, devolution not just to this Parliament but to the people and communities outside of here, government which reflects the people it serves in word and in action, not just token gestures. The best of both worlds, a strong Scottish Parliament and Scottish representation in the UK, politics driven by new ideas, not outdated grievance, and a belief that challenging injustice is better than walking away from it, and that common endeavour, not nationalism, is the truthful answer to the challenge we face. On behalf of Scottish Labour, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. This debate is very tight for time. Speeches of 6 minutes at the moment, but that will be reducing to 5 minutes. I call on Willie Rennie to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Although I did not support the referendum, it has given us a chance to explore the strengths and weaknesses of our nation. I think it helps because I believe we take so much of the UK for granted. Here are some of the many positive strengths I regard as part of the United Kingdom: the single energy market that keeps our bills lower and advances renewables, the single regulatory regime and the single currency that helps businesses trade freely across the United Kingdom, the shared research funding for universities that gives Scottish researchers 50% more funding. We know that these are positive strengths for the United Kingdom because the nationalists repeatedly tell us so. They like them so much they want to keep them. But it is their plans that will put an end to these strengths. In the topsy-turvy world of the nationalists, they argue for the things that they want to break. In this long campaign, we've also learnt more about the independence proposition. But questions remain. Let's take welfare, today cited in the Deputy First Minister's very negative amendment. She cites a £6 billion cut in the welfare budget for Scotland. Yet just a simple study of the White Paper tells us that reversing that cut isn't quite the priority that the SNP claim that it is for them. It does not provide for the promised big increase in social security spending, certainly not £6 billion or £2.5 billion, which was the previous figure. You would have thought, if they cared that much about the welfare budget, that they would have matched the funds with their words. The truth is that the SNP are planning to implement 98% of Ian Duncan-Smith's budget, far from reversing the welfare reforms that the SNP plan to lock them in. So much for the positive promise for an independent Scotland. Members will know of the Liberal Democrats' ambition on nursery education. Thanks to our pressure, thousands of two-year-old children will get 15 hours of nursery education each week from this autumn. That's alongside the expansion for 3- and 4-year-olds to match the provision in England. The SNP said this would not be possible without the powers of independence. Yet it has been delivered under devolution. And now we know, thanks to Spice, that the sums don't add up on childcare under independence either. In contrast, devolution in the UK has expanded childcare, another positive reason for the United Kingdom. Then there's the SNP's plans to cut corporation tax by 3 pence. I tabled a parliamentary questions in the summer asking how long it would take for the tax revenues to recover. The answers dodged the issue. I tabled a Freedom of Information request to get hold of the detailed modelling so we could work it out for ourselves. The response from the Scottish Government's official was interesting. This is good. She refused to give out the information and said, and I quote, "Releasing the data and assumptions behind the simulations may lead to opposition parties starting a debate." And went on to say, listen to this, that this would not be in the public interest. The Information Commissioner has now given permission for the Scottish Government to keep this information secret because ministers told her that policy in this area remained under active development and had not reached a settled view on it. For those of us who hear the mantra of certainty on corporation tax every day of the week, it's odd to find out that ministers have not finished working it out yet. And today we have heard from Professor Leslie Young, cited by the Deputy First Minister. Previously, she credited him with being an international expert, but she did not read out the full conclusions of what Professor Young had said. And he said this: all of the United Kingdom would be worse off if an independent Scotland formed a currency union with the rest of the United Kingdom than if the UK remained united. So not the full quote. We've obviously been criticised in the past for not providing the good quote. I thought the Deputy First Minister would have followed that rule. And Tom Hunter said in conclusion, he paid for this report. He said, this one narrow line of inquiry highlights the status quo as the best option for business.
Final minute.
Quite revealing. I'm particularly proud that we together across the United Kingdom have created the NHS, free at the point of access, the welfare state, the state pension, and now the second biggest aid budget in the world. And let's consider the positive contribution on the aid budget. It's praised internationally. It is also feeding thousands of children in Pakistan and Syria. It's immunising thousands of children in so many other countries in addition to those. I'm proud of what we do in the United Kingdom. I share Annabel Goldie's positivity about the United Kingdom. I am proud that I regard myself as British as well as Scottish. I don't want anybody to take any of those identities away from me. That's why I think we should stay in the United Kingdom together, because we have achieved so much together and we should continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Many thanks. Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I joined the Scottish National Party on General Election Day 1992, and I did so for one reason, because I felt that there was a democratic deficit in Scotland, and I realised that the Tories were about to win that general election. I firmly believe that decisions about the people of Scotland are best made here in Scotland. And let's look at where we are at this present moment in time. Including all of the MPs and Lords, people in Scotland elect just 4.1% of the UK Parliament. And even of those folks that we do elect to serve in the House of Commons, largely their opinions are ignored and mean very little indeed. And let's look at some of the recent votes that there have been, and some of the significant votes that there have been in the past. 76% of Scottish MPs voted against further austerity cuts in the 2010 budget. Ignored. So we have the continued carbon growth and we have the failures that austerity brings. 81% of Scottish MPs voted against the welfare cuts and the welfare benefits uprating bill. Ignored, and families right across this country are being put under further pressure. Certainly.
Neil Findlay.
One of the significant votes that wasn't ignored, of course, was the SNP MPs who went through the lobbies to bring in Thatcher. Why don't you refer to that, Mr Stewart?
Kevin Stewart.
Mr Findlay goes back to ancient history and the failings.
Order, please.
And the failings.
Order.
The failings of the Labour government under Jim Callaghan led to its own demise. And it mattered not one jot about a no-confidence vote because he was going to be out in his ear anyway. Right, let's continue with welfare. And I'd prefer it if Mr Findlay didn't shout over the top of me, presiding officer. Let's continue with welfare.
Mr Stewart, I have called for order, and hopefully we will get order right across the chamber. Please continue.
In terms of those welfare cuts, which Child Poverty Action Group say may lead to 50 to 100,000 children being pushed into poverty by 2020. That's not the kind of thing that the people of Scotland want. That is why the representatives that we have down there voted against these things, but they are ignored. Let's turn to Trident. 60% of Scottish MPs voted against Trident renewal in 2007. They are going to be ignored. Now, Annabel Goldie gave a stout defence there of nuclear weapons. I find it very difficult that anybody could do so. And she talked about global peace and our power in the global stage. Can I say at this moment in time, I have more regard for the Marshall Islands and their place in the global stage and their efforts to try and gain global peace by suing the nuclear powers for their actions. That is a country, a small country, that has suffered through nuclear testing, who realise the effects that these weapons bring. I say praise to the Marshall Islands, and let's follow their lead, and let's make sure that our country becomes nuclear-free after a yes vote later on this year. Let's concentrate, though, on some of the evidence that we've heard recently round about welfare cuts. We heard from Mr Cooling of the DWP at the Welfare Reform Committee yesterday, a man who had to come up here and defend Conservative ministers because they're too feared to come in front of the committee and defend their own policies and their own actions. Mr Cooling yesterday said that food banks, the rise of food banks, was not due to demand, but due to supply. I have never heard such claptrap in all of my life, and that quite clearly shows that neither he nor the ministers that he represents have actually taken the time and the energy to go and meet with folks who have to rely on food banks on a day-to-day basis. Jamie Livingston of Oxfam Scotland said yesterday of that remarks that they were not credible. And to deny the links between welfare cuts and food banks, in my opinion, is completely and utterly outrageous. We have a Secretary of State for Scotland who has proclaimed that our welfare system is fantastic. I would like him to say that in front of the many, many folks who are currently suffering because of the welfare cuts that are emanating from that place, Westminster. During the course of this debate and throughout the course of the referendum debate, we have heard scaremongering galore. We have heard Better Together proclaim themselves to be Project Fear. What I would say to the people of Scotland is on the 18th of September, vote for hope over fear, vote yes and get rid of that democratic deficit. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Clearly is hoping that merely spreading an anti-Tory message in Scotland will make people vote for the referendum. And this is not a general election for 5 years. This is a referendum for life. And I'm very happy to support the Conservative motion today, as well as, of course, as the Labour amendment, because I believe that there are certain clear advantages in the United Kingdom, irrespective of which government is in power there. And several of those features have been outlined in the motions, and indeed in Willie Rennie's speech when he talked about the single energy market. Annabel Goldie talks about the capacity to absorb financial shocks. We all remember 2008. She also talks about a stable currency, and clearly the reputation of sterling is an enormous asset for the whole United Kingdom, and one of the reasons why, of course, interest rates are low now and would be higher in an independent Scotland. The Labour amendment talks about pooling resources. It was mocked by Nicola Sturgeon. But, of course, there are many examples of that. Pensions, as described in detail by Gordon Brown in a major speech last week, is one classic example where we get hundreds of £1 million more than our population share going to the pensioners of Scotland. And jobs, of course, also mentioned by Drew Smith, financial services, shipbuilding and many other areas of employment that would be far more difficult in the event of an independent Scotland. Another good example, and it follows up what Willie Rennie said about the single energy market, is an article by Peter Jones in The Scotsman yesterday. He reminded us that the SNP are always complaining about the charging regime, and then listed about 5 different ways in which taxpayers in England and Wales help the renewable industries in Scotland, and said that came to £800 million a year. So all we hear from the SNP are the negatives. Well, there are many positive, irrespective of which government there is. And of course, I'm very critical of the Conservatives in many contexts. But let's remember the positives that prevail, whatever government we have. I give way.
Minister.
Accepting a UK if pernicious welfare policies, economic stagnation and increasing inequality are a price worth paying to stay in the Union, what exactly is the red line issue for a member of a social conscience such as Malcolm Chisholm?
I'm sorry I didn't actually follow the logic of that question. It was probably another attempt to kind of say that the Tories and Labour are somehow joined at the hip, which of course the SNP are very good at inventing the enemy, just as they're very good at inventing the future, as I'll describe in a moment. But of course, the SNP have Trotskyists and others on their side. No one's accusing Nicola Sturgeon of being a Trotskyist. Now, in terms of inventing the future, it is. I don't ask members opposite to read what the UK government has produced today. I only ask them to look at what the independent experts are saying. And many, many independent experts, we heard some at the Finance Committee this morning, are describing the fiscal challenges that exist for an independent Scotland. Now, of course, the SNP do quote experts selectively from time to time. I noticed Nicola Sturgeon quoting the National Institute of Economic and Social Affairs, one small part of their budgetary analysis on the radio the other morning, and yet I'll give their general view in a moment. Willie Rennie's pointed about the way in which Leslie Young is selectively quoted, and Standard & Poor's as well. I don't suppose the SNP are quoting Standard & Poor's at all this week, since they said that we were probably be in a situation like Ireland in 2008. But I haven't got time to quote all the experts that I've written here, but the general thrust is that, for example, Angus Armstrong and Monique Ebel, an independent Scotland is likely to require a more restrictive fiscal stance than proposed by the coalition government for many years. Rowena Crawford and Gemma Tatlow, also from the National Institute, our broad conclusion that Scotland faces a tougher long-run fiscal challenge than the UK as a whole is robust to a variety of alternative sensible assumptions. And I've got several other quotes which I will not give in the 2 minutes. I've mentioned interest rates already. Again, at the Finance Committee this morning, I specifically asked Angus Armstrong from the National Institute about this, and he said they would be higher even if there was a common currency, a monetary union, which there will not be, of course. But he said, of course, if there wasn't a monetary union, they would be higher still. There are many different reasons for that. One he quoted, for example, was the liquidity premium based on smaller bond markets. I've not got time, if I have got time, but I've only got a minute and a half left. This is the reality that is ignored by those who are unhappy with the current UK government. I understand that. I hear, obviously have a different view from Conservatives opposite. I understand their unhappiness, and they think, some of them, that the situation in Scotland cannot get worse. Well, the fact of the matter is that the situation in Scotland could get worse, just as the situation in the UK could get better, and I believe will get better with the election of a Labour government. And the nightmare for us, particularly on these benches, that in 2016 we might be faced with a radical Labour government in London taking action on market failure, taking action on income inequality, and we might be stuck here with a more right-wing SNP government cutting corporation tax and giving a free ride to the energy companies.
Order, please.
I use the word nightmare advisedly, because I said at the beginning, this is not a protest vote in a general election, it is a vote for life. Stephen Dedalus in the novel Ulysses famously said, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to wake." Well, having looked at all the evidence and listened to all the expert evidence, I believe that independence is a nightmare from which we would never awake.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, last year at the Festival of Politics, my family and I were lucky enough to have tickets to see the Scottish Youth Theatre's production of Now's the Hour. It was a play written by young people, for young people, about their thoughts, fears, aspirations and experiences of this referendum. And members of the Chamber may have shared my pleasure on Saturday evening in being able to watch a documentary about the making of Now's the Hour. And this play comes to no conclusion about which way to vote. But what it did demonstrate was how knowledgeable, practical, passionate and inspired the young people of Scotland are about this debate of independence. I was particularly taken with the exercise of writing a letter to one's future self, some 30 years down the line, about what the hopes and for the future would be for the young people, and it's something I think perhaps politicians would benefit from doing as well. I just hope I'd be around to read mine, inshallah.
Ms Adams, sorry, could you move your microphone round slightly? Thank you very much.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. The young people highlighted in the course of this documentary the big issues for them about the referendum, and it was about what kind of country we want to be, about the cohesion that our country might have, about our education and will it still be free? Will we still have nuclear weapons? What will climate change mean for a future Scotland? And the documentary, indeed the play, reminded me that Scotland's future is about these young people, their future and future generations. And on the 18th of September, it is the biggest opportunity to ask ourselves these big questions and the opportunity to shape the country that Scotland can be. Presiding Officer, I believe that the economic argument is made. There is no doubt that Scotland can more than afford to be an independent nation. Recent OECD figures show that Scotland would be the 14th richest nation in terms of GDP. And when it comes to oil, it is a bonus on top of Scotland's economic capabilities and demonstrated by the ratings agency Standards & Poor's. We should be independent, because Scotland has demonstrated time and time again that the political will is for policies of social justice. And yet again, we find ourselves with a Westminster government we didn't vote for, and a government whose policies will drive 100,000 more children in Scotland into poverty by 2020. At the same time, £100 billion will be spent on weapons of mass destruction on the Clyde. Yes, I will take.
Jenny Mara.
If her party and government are so committed to poverty, why they have taken £1 billion out of the poverty budget since they were elected in 2007?
Claire Adamson.
I would challenge Ms Mara's assertion. I would also challenge, given the debates that we have had in this chamber regarding poverty, about the commitment of this government in tackling these issues. And can I say to you, your colleague mentioned the bedroom tax and the action that this government has said, in a fixed budget, when we spend money mitigating against the bedroom tax, that's money not spent on other issues like poverty in Scotland. Presiding Officer, many of the voices of the young people in this documentary and from those on the doorsteps is worry. It's a worry that making the wrong decision, whatever that might be, that they will have contributed to making things worse. And Ms Malcolm Chisholm mentioned things could be worse, and they could be worse. We could move even further in the shameful position of the fourth most unequal country in the developed world. And if the austerity policies, as promised by Mr Osborne, continue, it's likely that we will. There's also the situation of the referendum on Europe, as promised by the Conservatives, or indeed whichever government might be elected to Westminster. Scotland, as we discussed in this very chamber last week, has a proud tradition as a European nation, one who wants to engage with Europe. And yet we could see ourselves dragged out on the back of votes from the rest of the UK from a position that Scotland wants to be in. There have been a few mentions in the course of the debate of other issues regarding Scotland at the moment, and Mr Rennie mentioned international development. And given that we've just celebrated the anniversary of one of the greatest people in the world who reached out to Malawi, a Scottish person, I think that we have to consider that the UK is one of the richest countries in the world, and yet that 0.7% target of GNI spent on international development has only been reached by them once last year. We could do so much more as an independent nation. I hope that what we take from the debate today is a thought that we are thinking about the future, about our young people, my own son, future generations, and what Scotland could be in the future. And I know for one, in my letter, I will have made the promise to myself that it's fundamentally better for all of us if the decisions about Scotland's future are taken by the people who care most about Scotland, and that is by the people of Scotland.
Thank you. I call Alex Rowley to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I remember the late Donald Dewar saying to me that devolution was a journey, and it is a journey that we're on. And I wouldn't disagree with Claire when she says that Scotland can be an independent country. Of course it can. I've certainly not an individual who's ever argued that Scotland can't be independent. The issue is it in Scotland's best interest to be independent, or is it in Scotland's best interest for a union with the rest of the United Kingdom, and as part of that union a strong devolved government in Edinburgh? And that certainly has been the position that I've always supported. And as we move forward in this debate, there are legitimate concerns that can't just be dismissed as scaremongering or Project Fear. And I think the Scottish people deserve better, and there are legitimate issues around Europe. There is legitimate issues around pensions. There's certainly legitimate issues around the pound. As I've said before, I don't believe it's in Scotland's interest, never mind England's interest or Wales or Northern Ireland's interest. If we have an independent Scottish state, it's not in Scotland's interest to be part of a currency deal with the rest of the United Kingdom. And these are legitimate questions. But I would say to Annabel Goldie that every time David Cameron and his cabinet of millionaires come up to Scotland and tell the Scottish people what they can't get, then I think the yes vote actually increases. And it would be advisable for them to think before they speak in terms of the messages that they actually bring up to Scotland. And it is also the case that if we look at the UK government right now and we look at welfare and welfare reform, I think within this chamber there is an exception so that we need to reform the welfare system that's out there. But the way to do that is not to drive people into absolute poverty and have a massive increase, as we've seen, food banks certainly starting up in every part of Scotland. So it would be very difficult for me on any campaign platform to say that the type of vision that I have for the future of Scotland would resemble the type of vision that I suspect the Conservative Party has, or certainly how we would achieve that vision as we go forward. But the type of vision that I have for Scotland, where we actually eradicate poverty, we have social stability, sitting alongside economic stability, the type of vision that I have not seen being brought forward by the SNP government in Scotland either. If you take housing, if you're going to address poverty, then you need to address the housing crisis that we have in Scotland. And yet the SNP government, in my time in local government, were cutting the housing budget monies that was coming in, certainly to Fife, into local government. If you look at jobs, training and skills, you look at the FE sector is being cut right across the country. We have the situation in my constituency where you have jobs, but you don't have the people with the skills, and therefore the large companies in my constituency have got recruitment agencies out there all over Europe recruiting people and bringing them back and building special accommodation in Fife to house those people. Something doesn't add up there, so you need a national skills strategy. Your vision for the future of Scotland has surely got to be a vision based on full employment. In order to achieve full employment, then you have to achieve the skills and the opportunities that go alongside that. I haven't seen that type of vision coming from the SNP government in Scotland, and therefore, the Labour vision that I want to see for the future of Scotland has those things within it. If you look at education, we need a radical overhaul. A progressive policy in education would be to look at the areas in the schools where there's less well-performing schools, and that tends to have a clear link with deprivation and poverty. In Fife Council, for example, in my own area, there has been over the last couple of years a deliberate policy decision to target more money into the deprived areas, and actually by using the free school meals quota that's there, actually targeting money into those areas, because there's a recognition that there's a clear correlation between the underperformance in some of these areas and poverty. I have not seen that kind of radical agenda, radical approach coming from the Scottish Government. So, in terms of looking to the future, a vision for me, and these other issues, the issues that are concerns here, have to be addressed. But the big issue for me is, what kind of vision do you want in Scotland for the future? Full employment, housing that's available at the point of need for people, a strong health service. And the question for me is, how best would you achieve those services? And how best would you achieve that ambition? Is it through an independent Scotland, or is it through a strong Scotland as part of the United Kingdom moving forward? And for me, it is the latter, and that's what it comes down to, and that's a hope which the debate will be as we move forward, so that we can debate all the concerns that's out there, we can debate the issues, we can put forward their vision, and ultimately it will be for the people of Scotland to decide on September the 18th. But I certainly will make the case for a stronger Scotland within the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Could I remind members to use each other's full names, please, for the record and for those watching our proceedings. John Mason, to be followed by Gavin Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the chance to take part in today's debate and thank the Conservatives for initiating it. I also think the concept of a family of nations, which they mention in their motion, is an important one, and I'd like to look a little bit at that today. Firstly, with my own personal experience, I had a reasonable relationship with my parents, despite the usual struggles in my teenage years, and they supported me in all sorts of ways, not least in helping me through a university education. But when I started working and was in my early 20s, I just so much wanted to move out and start living in my own place. And I have to say, I think my relationship with my parents improved after that. We still saw each other regularly, discussed serious matters, and even did things together. But we were not getting in each other's way so much, and I did not feel someone was always looking over my shoulder. And I suspect that is not an unusual story for a lot of young people. I do think there is a parallel there for Scotland. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the past, we are now grown-up people and can manage our own affairs. Now, there were some interesting phrases in the motion which I thought I would look at, 7 if I've got time. First of all, we have the phrase, the world's greatest family of nations. Now, is there actually any evidence for this, or is it just an assertion? It does smack to me a little bit of arrogant British nationalism looking down on others. What about all the other families of nations around the world? For example, the Commonwealth. That's a good family that I'm part of. Then I look around the world and I see the African nations, many of which have a good family relationship with each other. Same for the Arab nations and Latin nations. And more recently, I feel I'm part of the European family of nations. Are we seriously saying here today that the UK is the world's best family? That is what it seems to be saying. I don't think anyone else thinks that. Second interesting phrase, the UK can give us a stable currency. Willie Rennie.
Willie Rennie.
Say that Scotland would be the best small nation in the world. Is he now asking his ministers to refrain from using such a phrase?
John Mason.
Now, my memory is not perfect, but I think it might have been Jack McConnell that said that, if I am correct. Second interesting phrase, a stable currency. Is the pound this great stable currency that we are being led to believe? Well, it's not that long ago, I remember you could buy a euro for 70 pence. Checking the paper yesterday, I think it is 82. The reality is that the pound has been devalued because of poor management of the UK economy. Third interesting phrase, if it's quick, yes.
Drew Smith.
It will be very quick. If the pound is now back to being the millstone, then why is the Scottish Government so keen to be part of the pound at the same time as withdrawing any influence over all the issues that Mr Mason is talking about?
John Mason.
Well, currently we have zero influence, and the pound, it would be extremely convenient to use the pound. That is our first choice, but the White Paper makes it clear there are other options there. It is one of the bargaining chips on the table. Third interesting phrase, global influence. Right, does the UK actually have global influence? Not clearly as much as it used to. Again, this is an assertion. Is there any evidence of this? Now, I do accept that the UK tries to cling on to past influence by having nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers, as if it was a world power. But we all know the UK is now a second or even third-tier country, and even the nuclear weapons are only used with US permission. I've taken two already. Fourth interesting phrase. The UK has capacity to absorb financial shocks. Does the UK have that capacity? It has not actually recovered from the last shock. It is hugely in debt. It is still running a huge deficit. Household debt is one of the highest in the developed world. Capital and welfare expenditure are being severely cut. So the UK may have survived the last shock, but I don't think we could say it has absorbed the last shock. And heaven help us if the UK had to face another shock soon. Fifth interesting phrase. They want facts and detailed information. Can we also have that for the UK? Facts and information. Will the UK be in the European Union in 10 years' time? Could we have the facts on that? Will the Barnett formula continue? Facts on that. Will the UK join the euro eventually? Facts on that. Will the UK become a fairer society? Any facts on that? What about the statement I think I saw on a billboard from Better Together, which said more powers guaranteed? Are they guaranteed? Is that a fact? Actually, there are no facts about the future. We can have plans, we can have information, we can have vision. So let's be realistic in this debate.
Final minute.
Sixth, no currency sharing agreement. Well, is that just a bluff or is that part of the debate? We have no idea. Seventh, Scotland would be a new applicant. Well, the reality is I am a European citizen already. The EU has never faced this position before, and it will all be done by negotiation. However, I don't want to let Labour off entirely, and they have some interesting phrases also in their amendment. One which the Deputy First Minister already referred to. The Union allows redistribution to those with least. Well, to be fair, I suppose that is technically correct. The Union does allow for redistribution, but it just actually does not happen. When I was younger, the Labour Party at Westminster did actually go in for a bit of redistribution and nationalisation and such like. But even when they did, it got undone by the next Tory government. So the result is that we actually have one of the unfairest societies in the developed world, and surely Labour members do not think the UK is going to do any redistributing
I'm afraid
very
you must
soon.
close, please.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Gavin Brown, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Deputy Presiding Officer, thank you. I want to focus my remarks on an issue that has featured heavily in the Yes campaign, an issue that features in the SNP amendment, an issue that featured heavily in the Deputy First Minister's speech and in most of the SNP contributions so far.
Mr Brown, sorry, could you move your microphone round slightly? Thank you.
And that issue, Deputy Presiding Officer, is the issue of welfare, because it's an issue that the SNP and the Yes campaign use day in, day out. But it's worth looking at the facts around it to see what they're actually proposing and to see what commitments have actually been made by the Scottish Government. Because many of the claims put forward by the First Minister and indeed the Deputy First Minister are not backed up in cash by the Finance Minister, and I hope he can deal with some of the questions I pose in his closing contribution. Because we see the Scottish Government press release, £6 billion cut from welfare budget. They say they regret the decisions taken by the UK Government and it will remove £6 billion in welfare payments, and they say that we are committed to meeting against the harmful effects of Westminster welfare reforms. They want us, and they want the people of Scotland to believe that all of those welfare reforms and the entirety of the £6 billion that they put forward would be reversed in an independent Scotland. They say they have limited powers today. OK, let's put that to one side. But when they have all of the powers, in the event of a yes vote were it to happen, let's look at what they actually say they would do. Because they want us to think they would reverse everything. The reality is somewhat different. Because the single largest measure, and the Deputy First Minister will know this, the single largest measure from the welfare changes in financial terms is the switch from RPI indexation to CPI indexation that took place in 11-12 and has been in place since. It is the largest single measure by quite some distance. Now, I have asked this government on a number of occasions, would they reverse that? Would they make indexation, RPI indexation, in the event of an independent Scotland? Because if the answer to that question is no, then they cannot claim the single largest chunk within that £6 billion. That then becomes a false argument unless there is a clear commitment to reverse that decision. The second largest single measure was the removal, or in some cases the reduction, of child benefit from families with a higher rate taxpayer. Now, they say that those changes have hit families hard, but is there a commitment anywhere, the White Paper or in any single press release from this government, that they would reverse that decision and that all higher rate taxpayers would be entitled to child benefit? I haven't seen it mentioned once, and that is the second largest single part of that £6 billion. So there is no commitment to the largest measure. There is no commitment to the second largest measure. If you're not doing the two largest in the £6 billion, that figure loses a lot of its legitimacy. Let's look at what they have said they would abolish. They have said they would abolish the spare room subsidy. They have said they would restore housing benefit as a separate benefit. And they have said that they would review the assessments regime. So the question I want to pose to them is this. If you do all of that, and let's take at face value that they will do all that they say in the event that we become independent, how much of the £6 billion does that actually add back? Is it £100 million? Is it £200 million? Is it even £100 million? I think the people of Scotland have a right to know whether what they are saying on the campaign trail will actually be implemented in practice. Now, the fact I haven't had a single intervention from a single government minister or any of the MSPs suggests to me that the difference between what the UK government are doing on welfare and what a separate Scottish government would do in practice are not altogether different. They want to campaign on the issue. They believe it will get them traction. It may well get them traction. But in terms of what they would actually do, it's a very different picture. The changes on the ground would be minimal.
Final minute.
In my final minute, Deputy Presiding Officer, let me just return to a debate we had in this chamber a couple of weeks ago. Because we had a debate about the financial implications of an independent Scotland. We pointed out that the figures in the White Paper, such that they exist, had been overtaken by events, and they were overtaken by events some time ago. Where are the updated oil figures that we were promised by the Cabinet Secretary? He did say within a matter of weeks. Can he update Parliament today when they will actually be published? Because I think everyone has a right to see them, and we have a right to know. And while we're at it, the updated finances for post-16-17 that he promised again in that debate, when will we see them? Because as it stands, the Scottish Government says that the net fiscal balance for Scotland will be healthier than the UK, but every independent analyst publishing since then has said the opposite to that. Perhaps he can update Parliament today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Bruce Crawford for a speech of up to 6 minutes, and thereafter speeches will be 5 minutes. Bruce Crawford will be followed by Hanzala Malik.
Can I thank Annabel Goldie for bringing this motion for debate today? Its content has certainly provided me with an opportunity to reflect on what I think about Scotland's place in the United Kingdom. And I want to start by telling me about my family's connection to the British Armed Forces. Why I'm very proud of that connection, but why it has not blinded me to the truth. My grandfather served in the Great War with the Scottish Horse and fought in some of the most horrific battles of that conflict. I'm proud of my grandfather's role in that fighting, as he saw it fighting for Queen and country. My father was a member of the Royal Household Cavalry. He declared it almost every day of his life as he wore his Brigade of Guards tie until they were threadbare. I'm proud of my father's connections with the Royal Household Cavalry. And there was never a prouder father than myself at RAF Halton at the ceremony for one of my sons completing his RAF training. But I'll tell you, no matter how proud I've felt, I've never been blinded by that pride. I remember all my father's rage and his belief that the people of Scotland had been lied to by the Blair government in order to drag British armed forces into an illegal war in Iraq. An illegal war that the same son and I marched against, along with 100,000 others, through the streets of Glasgow to shout, "Not in our name." All, of course, to no avail, as the wishes of the majority of the people of Scotland were ignored. I'm not going to take any interventions today, Willie, unusually. My father also believed that if it had been Scotland's decision to make, Scotland's servicemen and women would never have been asked to take part in that illegal invasion of Iraq. My father was right. The political system in the UK failed Scotland when it came to the most important decision of all, the decision on whether or not to send people to war. Then let's look at the UK nuclear deterrent based on the Clyde. We know the colossal cost of creating and maintaining these weapons, £100 billion for the Trident replacement favoured by the Tories, Labour and Liberal Democrats. Yet here too we see the political system that fails the people of Scotland. Opinion polls show very clearly that Scottish populations overwhelmingly opposed to these obscene weapons of mass destruction being based in Scotland. A majority of MPs are against the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons. A majority of parliamentarians in this Scottish Parliament are against the renewal of Trident nuclear weapons. Where is the democracy for Scotland when it comes to the obscenity of nuclear weapons? And you know, when it comes to sport, I cheered as loudly as anyone when a British sportsperson was competing in the Olympics. And when England take to the field in this summer's World Cup, I'll be rooting for them to win, much to the astonishment of my sons. But none of this support will blind me to the fact that the current political system has and is failing Scotland. And that failing is only too well highlighted by the deceitful cover-up of the now infamous Macron report. A report prepared by a senior civil servant and delivered to the United Kingdom on the 23rd of April 1975 on the economic implications of Scottish independence. The report concluded that independent Scotland would have a large tax surplus to an embarrassing degree. Its finding was on no question whatsoever that Scotland could be a viable and prosperous independent country. The reaction of the UK Government classified the report as secret, like some piece of Cold War intelligence garnered by the security services, rather than a civil servant paid for by Scottish taxpayers. The Macron report is as clear an example as you could find of the interests of the Scottish people being sacrificed for the greater good of the United Kingdom. And what about taxation and benefits? Here too, the case for remaining locked within the UK falls down. We only need to look a short time back to the poll tax to see and understand Scotland's place in the Union. This iniquitous tax was implemented in 1989 in Scotland 1 year earlier than in England and Wales. It was introduced in the face of fierce opposition across Scotland and a campaign of non-payment which I was involved in myself. The poll tax was of course repealed, but only following riots on its introduction in England and Wales. It's a telling fact that this tax was only dispensed of when voters south of the border refused to countenance it, when Scotland's wishes were obviously inconsequential. So I can take pride in my family's involvement in the British Armed Forces and support British sporting people on the field of sport. But Scotland's constitutional relationship with our neighbours across these islands must change, so that Scotland's governments and political institutions always and unquestionably serve the interests of the Scottish people. So while I said at the beginning, the Tory motion provided me with an opportunity to reflect on what I feel about being part of the United Kingdom. Regrettably, however, the motion is mostly an unconvincing series of rambling assertions, a confused defence of a political union that's long since lost any benefit it may have ever had for the vast majority of the people of Scotland. My conclusion is that the best interests of the Scottish people will only be served when the people of Scotland have control of their own future. And I'm confident the majority across this country will reach that same conclusion and vote for independence on the 18th of September.
Thank you. I call Hans Malik to be followed by Stuart Maxwell. Speeches of 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much and good afternoon, Presiding Officer. I also thank Annabel Goldie for securing today's debate. Thank you very much for that, Annabel. My nationality is Scottish, my passport is British, and my citizenship is European. These three strands of my identity do not conflict with my enjoying over 300 years of economical and political union within the United Kingdom. And we don't need independence to identify ourselves. No one can say how successfully independent Scotland would negotiate its relationships with other countries or it enter into various global bodies. That we do not know is what we do know is that the UK is already established and respected world power and uses its influence for our common good. My very clear impression from speaking to voters is that they don't want independence, but they just want devolution to work better. Most Scots want to continue the success of devolution and not to go alone or choose to separate from the rest of the UK with all the risks and uncertainties it brings. I want the best for my country. I want us to have control of Scottish affairs while also having the power, influence and strength to reach through our membership of the UK and have the immense trade and freedom of movement benefits of being in the European Union. In short, I want us to have the best of both worlds, and why not? The SNP wants to gamble with that future, so our country and its people's livelihoods in its drive to separate from the UK, which will not be all rewards and no risks. Our future with the UK will have the capacity to reduce those risks, and everyone in the UK can be proud of their individual countries while remaining fully committed to the European Union. If we leave the UK and renegotiate or are denied entry into the European Union, we will be out on our own with no pound or euro. The Scottish Government has failed to give any guarantees regarding membership to the European Union. The SNP says Scotland will automatically join the European Union. Has the European Union agreed to Scotland's membership? Not to best of my knowledge. The SNP said that it won't have nuclear weapons in Scotland, so why join NATO? And has NATO agreed to Scotland joining under these terms and conditions? Not to my knowledge, and I look forward to some clarification on that. The SNP says it will keep the pound. To me, that's the biggest joke. Who's agreed to this? I, for one, don't want the country to follow the Pied Piper over a cliff into the economic unknown. I, with the Labour Party, say no to such suggestions. In terms of how we in Scotland feel and believe, there's a lot of talk about people serving in the armed forces and how patriotic they were and how patriotic Scots they are. Well, there was a survey carried out in Glasgow amongst university and college students which suggested that people from minority communities were more Scots than Scots themselves. I would like to think I'm one of those minority Scots who is more Scottish than Scots. And I can tell you, I've travelled the world and I've seen the unfortunate and the hardship that people suffer. This is not the countries of Africa and other second, third world countries looking for independence. We are a professional, smart, clever, and a country of inventors. But what I don't want to do is pretend that we can throw all that away and take a gamble and go into the unknown with no guarantees of whatsoever for my children and grandchildren. I will not stand by idly and allow that to happen. I will certainly not be voting yes. I can assure you the House of that. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Now Colin Stewart Maxwell to be followed by Murdo Fraser. Up to 5 minutes, please.
It's good to hear, Presiding Officer, that the prophets of doom are still amongst us, as we've just heard from Hanzala Malik. I mean, frankly, a more depressing speech I've seldom heard in this place. Lord Robertson must be very proud of you, Mr Malik. I thought it would be apt, Presiding Officer, to begin, however, with a quote from the Prime Minister. Supporters of independence will always be able to cite examples of small, independent and thriving economies across Europe, such as Finland, Switzerland and Norway. It would be wrong to suggest that Scotland could not be another such successful independent country. On this point, I agree with the Prime Minister. But Mr Cameron, of course, isn't the only UK political leader to see the benefits of being a small, independent country. During a speech on social mobility to the Sutton Trust in 2012, a certain Ed Miliband said, "When you look around the world and compare rates of social mobility, there is a striking fact. If you are born poor in a more equal society like Finland, Norway or Denmark, then you have a better chance of moving into a good job than if you are born poor in the United States." Both Ed Miliband and David Cameron accept that being a small country is no barrier to delivering fairness, equality and prosperity. OECD figures show that 7 out of the 10 of the richest countries in the developed world have populations of less than 10 million people. The question is, however, if these examples of small nations are able to thrive as successful independent countries, then why can't Scotland? I believe that rather than just looking towards other countries for examples of how to do things differently, an independent Scotland can lead the way and set standards for equality and fairness that will be envied across the world. I see September's referendum as a once-in-a-generation chance to change Scotland for the better. For me, independence is a means to an end, not an end in itself. It's about giving us the tools to build a better country. It's about shaping Scotland into a country that meets our aspirations of fairness, prosperity and opportunity. I want to see Scotland maximise its potential and take advantage of the opportunities that independence will bring. The reality is that this can only happen if Scotland can untie itself from a Westminster system of government that continues to hold our country and, more importantly, our people back. The Sutton Trust estimates that the richest 10% of UK households own 44% of the UK's wealth. By contrast, the poorest 50% of UK households own less than 10% of the country's wealth. Figures show that there has been a 400% increase in food bank use as a result of cuts implemented by the Tory-led UK government. 1 in 5 children here grow up in poverty, and Oxfam has said up to 100,000 more children in Scotland will push into poverty by 2020 due to decisions taken at Westminster. Clear evidence that the Westminster welfare system is not working for the people of Scotland. Scotland's potential to take a different approach to welfare was highlighted last week by Morag Gillespie of the Scottish Poverty Information Unit at Glasgow Caledonian University. In evidence submitted to this Parliament, Ms Gillespie outlined the devastating impact that Westminster's cuts are having on households. She said that independence presents a unique opportunity for Scottish society to take a different path, one that aims for a society free of poverty and where inequality is much reduced compared with today. Mr Brown.
Gavin Brown.
I simply ask the member, based on the White Paper, what percentage of the $6 billion would be reversed by an independent Scotland?
What I'm interested in is the fact that we have the opportunity, every single party, I'm answering your question, every single party in their manifesto for 2016 can put forward a tax and welfare programme. You can do it, we can do it, even the Labour Party might be able to do it. But the fact remains, it would give the people of Scotland the democratic choice to choose the future that they want and choose the welfare and tax system that they want, which they can't do today.
As you move into your last minute.
We know that the majority of Scots want decisions over welfare and social security to be taken here in Scotland, and only a yes vote will ensure that this happens. I was very interested to read comments last week from former Labour MP Brian Wilson, who made the plea to Scots not to vote yes in September because, and I quote, it would consign the rest of the UK to permanent Tory rule. Now, I've heard this argument repeated several times in Labour circles, but of course it's a complete myth. However, the idea that it should be up to Scottish voters to save the rest of the UK from the Tories is fundamentally wrong and fundamentally undemocratic. The people of the rest of the UK have the right to get the government they vote for. That's what democracy is all about. The irony of Brian Wilson's comments is that they only serve to remind us that a yes vote will ensure that Scots are no longer subjected to policies that votes countries they do not vote for. We have 140 days to go, and on September the 18th we have a chance, a once-in-a-lifetime chance, to grasp the power of opportunity for future generations, and we should take it by voting yes.
I now call on Murdo Fraser to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Annabel Goldie said at the start of this debate, the United Kingdom is a success story. Over more than 300 years, it has been a force for good in the world. Now, we've got used to all the relentless negative carping from the separatist campaign for Scottish independence about the UK. We've heard lots of that this afternoon from Nicola Sturgeon and others. They constantly repeat nonsense such as claims that we are the fourth most unequal country in the world, claims entirely without foundation. And yet we know that the reality is that the reputation of the United Kingdom is high across the world as a beacon of freedom, democracy and human rights. And I would just gently say to the SNP benches, as such a beacon, we stand in something of a contrast to the now much admired Russian Federation, even with its now revived sense of national pride. But nowhere are we better placed to celebrate the success of the UK than if we look at the state of our economy. Because due to the hard work and endeavour of millions of men and women across our country, our economy is growing strongly out of recession. And we saw just yesterday the publication of the latest growth figures showing the fifth consecutive period of GDP growth. And we are seeing a sustained and steady recovery, and with manufacturing and construction all registering expansion, a more balanced economy. And crucially, projections show that the UK economy is likely to be the fastest growing in the Western world in coming years. And let's never forget that throughout the last 5 years, and beyond that, all the SNP have told us is that the UK economy will never grow, that it will continue to stagnate. They simply called this wrong, as they have called so much else wrong. So while the economy across the UK and... Yes, of course.
May I not agree that from the discussions this afternoon, it's not the size of the economy, it's the inequality in the economy that is of concern in these benches?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, I think we should start to celebrate the fact that the economy is doing better, in contrast to all the doom and gloom we heard over the last 5 years from the SNP benches that it would never happen. But there are threats to the success of the Scottish economy. The oil and gas industry has been absolutely vital to our economic success in recent decades. And yet, as this Parliament's Economy Committee heard in Aberdeen on Monday, there are real concerns in that industry about the potential transition to independence. Both Professor Alex Kemp of Aberdeen University, a man much quoted in this chamber by the First Minister, and Penelope Warren, who is the senior partner of CMS Cameron McKenna, raised concerns about the timescale for the transition to independence of a mere 18 months. Professor Kemp said, in terms of all the work that would have to be done in restructuring the tax and regulatory regimes, this timescale was, and I quote, very, very tight. And crucially, there would be need for a high level of expertise to be brought in by the Scottish Government to set up a licensing regime and resolve all the issues that would arise. And it is unclear from where this would be drawn. Penelope Warren told the committee there were some 13,000 treaties affecting the oil and gas sector, each of which would require to be renegotiated. And there is simply nobody within the Scottish Government today who has that level of expertise, and highly unlikely that staff currently working in DEC would be interested in relocating to Scotland to do that job. And even if there were the capacity in international legal firms to provide that expertise, it would only be available at very high cost. It would be, Deputy Presiding Officer, a veritable goldmine for lawyers. Not always a bad thing, incidentally. Now, I checked the Scottish Government's white paper to see what it had to say about the transition to independence for the oil and gas sector, but I struggled to find a single mention. And yet this is a vitally important question for the energy sector and for Scotland's economy more generally. And perhaps Mr Swinney, in winding up, can tell us, how does he respond to these concerns? Where is this expertise going to come from? What assessment has the Scottish Government made of the cost and how it will be provided? Or are experts like Professor Kemp and Penelope Warren simply dismissed as scaremongering? And the other great challenge facing the oil and gas sector is the cost of decommissioning. Who is to pay for the sums involved? The Scottish Government believes that some of the liability should fall on Westminster. But these are the self-same Scottish ministers saying that in the event of Westminster maintaining its position on a currency union, they would happily default on Scotland's share of the UK national debt. If the Scottish Government were to maintain that foolhardy position, then the whole decommissioning costs would fall on the Scottish taxpayer with most serious consequences. Presiding Officer, Scotland's economy is doing well as part of the UK, but our economic recovery is under threat. The SNP cannot answer the most basic questions about the consequences of a yes vote. We can only conclude that only a no vote in September's referendum will ensure the future of Scotland's economy.
Thanks very much. Now call on Chick Rory to be followed by Hugh Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I have to say that last contribution was a very selective rewriting of a two-day history. Not something I recall at all. The motion is a bit like Back to the Future. Because
I think your microphone needs to be elevated.
Sorry, because what we have in the motion today is a cri de coeur for Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom, despite the huge democratic deficit from those supporters who wish then to take the UK out of Europe, where there is no such obvious deficit. The danger, I believe, that will seriously afflict the rest of the UK is not Scottish independence, but a European exit in 2017. Presiding Officer, over the last 4 days of recess, I spent some time with my family at Hampton in Surrey. And the news is the UK is already dividing. London and the South East is of another planet economically, socially and environmentally, and not all good. How can the motion, Presiding Officer, claim realistically that this, quote, full union provides equal opportunity when we have queues at food banks, caps on welfare spending, one of the world's largest gaps in income equality, while the many in the City of London garner bonuses equal to 200% of their already significant salaries, and the housing bubble sees the prices of houses in the South East rise by 70%, as they have done over the last 18 months, while we consign people to the streets because they have spare bedrooms. The stability of the currency, Presiding Officer, is affected not by the record of the UK export, but if you look at its construction and its manufacturing performances, they're appalling. But it is underpinned by something that is quite close to home. That's Scotland's economic performance and the return on its major asset. Even George Osborne was demanding a more balanced and export-driven economy for the UK on his trip to Hong Kong. And the claim that capacity to absorb financial shocks belies the fact, and I have to say this to Baroness Goldie, Annabel Goldie, that Barclays, England's largest bank with debts of £550 billion, was bailed out by American and Qatari interests. Now, that said, Presiding Officer, one thing is certain. If Westminster, we continue to fight over the past and the present, then we shall lose the future. That's why the case, Presiding Officer, I believe, for a future independent Scotland is irrefutable. And it also, I believe, will help the rest of the UK to awaken from its empirical slumber, whether it be the proposition for democracy, the opportunities for the economy, the attainment of real social justice, the right to communicate internationally, the leadership of a serious environmental challenge. In all of these, the democratic rights, the democratic choice of the collective Scottish nation is paramount. In the fulfilment of these, Scotland can and will be a real success story. The political proposition is nowhere more substantiated than when we have a fully representative government with control over its own affairs. In 2010, the UK coalition government gained 36% of the Scottish vote. 64% of people voted against it. But yes, they continue to legislate for large parts of our nation. Of the past 70 years, in 35 of them, Scotland was governed by UK parliaments it didn't vote for and it didn't want. Only a properly constituted Scottish future demands better than that. Independence and independence only will correct the resulting impact of elements of Scotland's democratic deficit. And so it is with the economic case, a case that enhances not only Scotland's argument for independence, but will help, I believe, a clearer economic focus for the remainder of the UK. And I could go on, Presiding Officer, but time is limited, to talk about the
40 seconds.
Social justice, the environment and so on. So, what I believe in terms of the sabre rattling that goes on tends to hide what there is for us in the future. And as we look to the future, as we write an increasingly Scottish success story, the only thing that we will consign to history will be the Treaty of Union, which was meant to be a working union agreement between two nations. It was certainly not a takeover.
Thank you very much. I now call on Hugh Henry to be followed by Patrick Harvie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This afternoon, in many of the speeches, we've heard a lot of anger, understandably, about the state of the United Kingdom and unfairness. But the truth be told, many of these arguments that are being put forward are not really of interest to people who have always been Scottish nationalists, because their view is that Scotland is better off out of the United Kingdom, irrespective of whether the United Kingdom is doing well or not. Their argument is that Scotland is better off irrespective of the colour of government and power at Westminster. So the argument about what we currently see as perceived unfairness or differences in wealth in different parts of the country are actually irrelevant to people who are fundamentally Scottish nationalists. Certainly.
Mr. Harvie.
Grateful to Mr Henry for giving way. I would like him just at least to acknowledge that the breadth of the independence movement as it now stands is far beyond the group of people he's defining as, dyed-in-the-wool nationalists with a capital N. Is it not so much broader?
Patrick Harvie makes the point for me, that there are many people now espousing a vote for separation who were never fundamentally Scottish nationalists, and for a whole range of reasons, they now happen to think that breaking away from the United Kingdom is going to cure some of the perceived unevenness or unfairness. But Malcolm Chisholm made the point in his contribution that this is not about changing the colour of a government. This is about changing fundamentally the relationship once and for all. And if people wake up and realise at some point in the future that they have made a mistake or that what has been promised is not being delivered, there is no going back. Now, we heard a lot in a number of the contributions. Nicola Sturgeon talked about bluff and bluster. And John Mason, I think, quite rightly said, when he was talking about the motion, that he would want to see, he said, is it evidence or is it assertion? He wants facts and he wants information. And Bruce Crawford condemned what he described as rambling assertions. But the problem is that we are being asked to vote on whether we leave the United Kingdom basically based on bluster, bluff and assertions. Now, I have asked many questions of the Scottish Government, and in most of the answers I get, they refer me back to other questions that have been answered. And then when I go to those questions, I see that there was no answer in them either, and then they're referred back elsewhere. Or I'm referred to the so-called white paper that is long on words and short on actual detail. So what is it that we're being asked to decide upon? Well, we're being asked to accept the assertions of the Scottish Government on EU membership, even though Viviane Reding, the Vice President of the European Commission, says that Scotland would have to apply as a new member state. Not good enough for the Scottish Government, accept the assertions of Alex Salmond and his colleagues. We are being asked to accept their assertions about whether or not they would have to join the euro. We are being asked to accept their assertions that the pound sterling would continue, irrespective of what others have got to say about this. And of course, we are also being asked to accept their assertions, with no guarantees and no evidence that John Mason wants, their assertions about the continuation of a European rebate. No evidence whatsoever that if Scotland became an independent member of the European Union, that rebate would continue. No evidence that all the other member states in the European Union would vote for it. Asked to accept their assertions about the ability to levy tuition fees on English students. Asked to accept their assertions that if Scotland had a more liberal immigration policy than the rest of the United Kingdom, that there would be no border, irrespective of the huge differences between those two countries. Asked to accept their assertions on Research Council funding with no evidence and no guarantees. Asked to assert their evidence on cross-border pensions and the filling in of the black hole. So fundamentally, we are being asked to make a decision about ripping up the constitutional structure of this country, leaving the United Kingdom with no evidence presented, no backup, no guarantees, all bluff and bluster from Alex Salmond and his colleagues. This is fundamentally a pig in a poke referendum.
Many thanks. Now call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Less than a week ago, Deputy Presiding Officer, it felt as though the whole of Scotland was on its feet, applauding Jim Sillars, who had delivered Margaret MacDonald's message to us that in this debate we can treat each other as opponents, but we must not treat each other as enemies. I'm very pleased that for the most part today's debate has been focused on the arguments and has seen less of the personal hostility that we're sometimes guilty of. If we achieve that tone in our debate for the next few months, we'll be doing far more use for Scotland, regardless of whichever decision the voters decide to choose. I'd like to apologise, first of all, for missing the first couple of sentences just of Annabel Goldie's opening speech, but I did hear very clearly from her the story of what she calls success in the UK. And I think the argument that we have is simply one of what success looks like. Annabel Goldie may look, for example, at the City of London and see something that is successful. She might call it perhaps a powerhouse of the UK economy. I look at it and I see a culture of greed that I can only describe as moral failing as well as economic failing. I look at a government which is prepared to cut taxes for the richest and cut benefits for the poorest, and I see that as a record of failure in a moment. And I see, even during times under any government, when there are sustained periods of economic growth, some would call that success. I look at the proceeds of that growth benefiting mostly those who need it the least, and the social and environmental costs of that growth being heaped on those who can defend themselves the least well from it, and I see a record of failure. Mr Henry.
Patrick Harvey has been consistent in his condemnation of the culture in the City of London. But he mentioned Margaret MacDonald, who will be missed by us all. But would he agree that Margaret MacDonald was at least logical in many of her arguments, for example, about the currency, that if Scotland became an independent state, there should be a separate Scottish currency? And would he also agree that if there is a separate Scottish state, Scots should have the right to decide whether or not they remain part of the European Union?
Patrick Harvey.
Well, they certainly have the right to make democratic decisions of all kinds, and I think Mr Henry knows that I am open to the arguments for a Scottish currency. The SNP are in government. They have a right to advocate for their view as well. Annabel Goldie also made the argument about Scottish influence. And frankly, I was a wee bit astonished that she chose to highlight Trident as part of that argument. Now, I understand the transition that many made from supporting unilateral disarmament to multilateral disarmament. And Annabel Goldie may not have been on that particular journey, but she made the case for multilateral disarmament, despite the fact that it is the precise opposite of what the UK government is proposing at the moment. The UK government is proposing unilateral rearmament, the very opposite of multilateral disarmament. Now, I've been advocating the minority position on many debates over my time. I'm in the Green Party, after all, and I respect anyone who can stick to their guns, if I can use a weaponised metaphor in this case. Annabel Goldie, though, should recognise that in the case of Scotland's view, either Scotland's MSPs or Scotland's MPs or Scotland's wider public opinion, support for renewal of Trident is a minority position. It's simply not credible to say that Scotland has influence on this position when we're getting the policy that most Scots don't want to see. One brief further intervention.
Annabel Goldie.
Very briefly, I tried to pose a reasoned argument about why I understand the sensitivity surrounding Trident, but the question I would put to Mr Harvey is, how does simply removing Trident from Scotland and placing it anywhere, how does that contribute to any discussion about nuclear disarmament?
Harvey, 45 seconds.
For the first part, it's a morally credible position. If we oppose nuclear weapons, we should not host them, nor join a nuclear alliance. Secondly, it forces the UK to re-evaluate its decision about who's going to be lumbered with these morally offensive weapons of mass murder. Annabel Goldie also said she's not ready to jack in the Union Jack. And I say to that, quite right. Quite right. Because Britishness and Scottishness as cultural identities are not under threat. The cultural identity of Scottishness is not under threat in the current constitutional settlement. The cultural identity of Britishness will not be under threat. I'm not motivated by flags on either side. But for those whose national identity is meaningful to them, this is not an issue of threat. I look forward, Deputy Presiding Officer, to Scotland moving forward with confidence in the event of a yes vote, and for all of us to continue to treat each other, perhaps as opponents, but never as enemies.
Thank you. Calling Mark MacDonald now to be...
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And following on from my colleague Bruce Crawford, the issue around my family's history and links to the British Armed Forces also sprang to mind during Annabel Goldie's remarks, because my grandfather fought in World War II with the Gordon Highlanders Tank Regiment in Burma. And if he were still alive today, he would be voting yes in September. But this is obviously a debate that should be focused on Scotland's future, not Scotland's past. But at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder why it was that Annabel Goldie chose to focus her remarks around Scotland's regiments when the very regiment that my grandfather served in, the Gordon Highlanders, was disbanded by the Conservative Party, and many other Scottish regiments since have been disbanded by UK governments in the face of opposition from not just those who served in those regiments, but those who were elected in Scotland and wider Scottish civic society. Another example, I think, of where the views of Scotland do not play a... I'll maybe come back to Annabel Goldie later once I've had a chance to speak. But another example, following on from Patrick Harvey has said, where the opinion of Scotland appears to count for little when it comes to the decision of Westminster. But I think most people now accept, Presiding Officer, that on the no side of this debate, that Scotland is a wealthy nation which can afford to be independent. Although I might suggest that I found Malcolm Chisholm's speech where he spoke about independence being a nightmare from which we would never awaken. I have to say, I think Mr Chisholm has now started trying a bit too hard in this debate to convince others of his position, having perhaps decided that he needed to do so. And I was interested also by the remarks of Hanzala Malik, who said that he would understand this debate if we were having it in an African nation or a nation in the Third World, rather than in a prosperous society such as Scotland, which strikes me as odd that the position appears to be that independence is okay for the nations of Africa who chose to declare their independence, but somehow would be wrong for Scotland to take that position. And I think that Scotland is perfect. Well, I'll give Mr Malek an opportunity to perhaps clarify his remarks.
Zala Malek.
Thank you very much. I think there's 2 points I want to make. One is that I also took the oath to serve Queen and Country in the Royal Engineer Regiment, so we're not all, we've all taken our bit and part for that, and I would never hesitate to move away from giving my life for my country. And the second thing was the disparity which you seem to don't understand is that in African nations people lost a lot of lives. Hopefully we won't lose a lot of lives, but what we will lose is something very precious and very dear to us, and that is a history of working together as one nation.
Mark MacDonald.
What I would say to Mr Malek is that he identifies quite correctly that this independence debate and the movement towards Scottish self-determination is almost unique in the sense that it has taken place without the kind of conflict and bloodshed that has been seen all too often in other movements for independence. And I think that is to the great credit of Scotland and indeed to the wider UK in the way that the debate has been framed in that regard. But what I would say to him is that, independence for other nations out there, many of whom declared their independence from London, was right for them, and it continues to be right for them. And no nation that has ever declared its independence and become an independent nation has gone back to the nation from which it declared independence and said, I think we've made a mistake, we'd like to come back, because they recognise that even while there are challenges that you face in the future as an independent country, you face them as an independent country, you take responsibility for the decisions that you take. Now, some of the arguments that have been deployed in this debate and in the wider debate, Presiding Officer, deserve to be touched upon. I'll leave the Trident argument because Patrick Harvie has demolished that quite successfully. Murdo Fraser said that the UK serves as a beacon of human rights across the globe. Tell that to those homosexual African asylum seekers who are being deported by the Home Office, and tell them that the UK is a beacon of human rights. The argument has been used, and I've only got 30 seconds left, Mr Fraser. The argument has been used that somehow, if we became independent, we would make those members of our family who live elsewhere on these islands into foreigners. That's offensive for 2 reasons, Presiding Officer. Firstly, because it uses foreigner as a pejorative term and assumes that it's something to be afraid of. Secondly, I have family who are Canadian and live in Canada. They are my family first and foremost. My love for them is not diminished by their geographical position, nor will it be for my friends and family south of the border in the event of Scottish independence. So can we please ensure that in future in this debate, these arguments are no longer used? And finally, Presiding Officer, because it was quite a long intervention.
You must close, please. I'm really sorry. We're now moving to the closing speeches. Thank you very much, notwithstanding. Colin Jenny Mara, up to 6 minutes, please.
Officer, consider a people saying no. Throughout history, many people have said no to governments, and that is the precious prize of democracy. People say no to governments when that government oversteps the boundary of what people want their country to be. Saying no is a brave and considered reaction to governments who propose ideas without popular support. Saying no is the natural language of protest, and saying no is a radical response. It is, Presiding Officer, what comes after that no that will define us. A no vote next year will be a positive and confident decision to stay part of the United Kingdom. A yes to being part of a bigger family of nations, a positive reassertion of popular support for devolution, which allows Scots to make the decisions that matter to all of us. But it does leave us with questions to answer on the 19th of September. We need to answer the call for change in our communities, because most analysis would say that there wasn't a desperate cry for a referendum on independence. They would say that the SNP simply won an overall majority in this Parliament. But even if you look at it differently, that this referendum is happening because people are dissatisfied with their lives, and many are, then that leaves us on the 19th of September next year in the event of a no vote with a big challenge: how to make people's lives better. And I truly believe that there is greater opportunity to start that process of change in September inside the United Kingdom, on that day, to start reshaping Scotland, our country, inside the UK. Because our challenges in this country are not specifically Scottish. Unemployment, persistent youth unemployment and child poverty, fuel poverty that stems from these, are shared by post-industrial European economies. Now, these problems vary. Spain has twice the rate of youth unemployment that we face. Our health in Scotland is markedly worse than our European neighbours. But the fundamental economic challenges of declining industry and manufacturing are not born of or in Scotland. They are born of developing economies and cheaper labour markets. The manufacture of ATMs did not leave my home city for Hungary because Scotland is in the UK. They left because labour costs were lower in Eastern Europe. And leaving the United Kingdom will not solve that. There are no easy answers, but I think a transformational start for our country in September would be to radically improve our infrastructure: rail, air links and capacity, dualling the A9 to open up our Highland economy. But how do you fund this in this current stultified climate of debate that the Scottish Government have set, that everything must be free? Can we really honestly expect to innovate and change and transform without properly paying for it? There is no evidence, there is no good evidence that an independent Scotland would have a greater tax take. So a yes vote won't provide for this. No, I've got a lot to get through today. I've got a lot to get through. We need to radically reform our health service. Our poor health holds back our well-being and our economy. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, alcohol addiction and cancer must be tackled. Two-thirds of our health budget, two-thirds, is spent on diagnosis and treating illness. We should be focusing on preventative spend, turning it on its head and investing in large-scale alteration of diets and activities. Because can we honestly expect to continue in the same health patterns and improve our health record and our economy? Now, these are the most important challenges facing us, not the Constitution. I would include education in that. I recently heard of a secondary school in my region where 40% of the first years had a reading and writing age of primary 2. This is a disgrace. Literacy is the greatest gift we can give to our children. We pride ourselves on Scottish education, but we need to ask some hard questions. Presiding Officer, there is no such agenda, such as the one I have outlined in the Scottish Government's White Paper. The SNP try to make the case that they have a social democratic agenda for Scotland, but they have no track record, no analysis and no solid commitment on redistribution and equality. Their only tax pledge is a cut in corporation tax, and that has also been blown apart today. The White Paper is stark in its lack of ambition. The only progressive ideas on childcare and gender quotas are things that the Labour benches have been calling for in this chamber for months. And the living wage, the latest litmus test of the SNP's commitment to redistributive politics. An EU spokesperson confirmed this week what I told the Deputy First Minister in this chamber last week, that there is no legal barrier to the living wage becoming a stipulation of a contract. So what is she doing about it now? Scottish and Southern Energy told me this morning that they are demanding of all their new contractors that they pay the living wage to their workers. And the Deputy First Minister may like to note that the EU law governing the energy markets is very similar to the public procurement rules.
In your final 15 seconds.
I hope that the Deputy First Minister will prove me wrong and prove that the SNP has a social democratic vision for Scotland. But the populist policies of nationalism do not allow it. I hope she proves me wrong and gives the Scottish workers a May-Day living wage this year.
Thank you very much. I now call on John Swinney. 8 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, this debate, I think, was started on a good tone by Annabel Goldie in giving, from her perspective, and it's one with which I, and she will appreciate, I have fundamental disagreement, a perspective of her view of the world and the role of the United Kingdom within that world. I, for example, don't think that the United Kingdom is universally respected across the globe for the involvement that the United Kingdom government of the time delivered for us by their involvement in the illegal war in Iraq. I think that did fundamental damage to the credibility of the United Kingdom on the international stage and the way in which the United Kingdom takes these decisions. And I, for one, was profoundly opposed to the illegal action that was undertaken by the United Kingdom government, and the point was reinforced by my colleague Bruce Crawford in a fantastic speech to Parliament today, which I thought crystallised some of the issues that many members of the public will be wrestling with as they consider the issues around the referendum, of loyalties that they will inevitably feel, as Annabel Goldie expressed, towards the United Kingdom because of all sorts of connections of history, of common practice, of involvement in shared institutions, but who are interested and want to be persuaded about the arguments about why it is in the inherent best interest of the people of Scotland to take control of their own affairs through the independence referendum. So, in a sense, the contrast between Bruce Crawford's speech and Annabel Goldie's speech, I think, was very helpful for members of the public, because they would see in both of those contributions two distinguished parliamentarians wrestling with the fact that, of how we should analyse our long-standing and historic connections as part of the United Kingdom. And Bruce Crawford clearly mapped out how individuals, despite the depth of their connections with the United Kingdom, can take a view that it is right and proper and effective for the future for our country to be in control of our own affairs through a yes vote in the referendum. There was also in the debate, Presiding Officer, a fundamental contradiction in some of the arguments, and the argument was essentially put for me in its greatest point of contradiction by Willie Rennie. Mr Rennie said, and you'll forgive me if I don't quote him exactly, but it was sentiments of this type, which I'm quite sure he will confirm, that he was proud that we had all built the National Health Service together within the United Kingdom. It was a remark of that type. And that begs for me the question, well, if we're proud that we built the National Health Service together, why did we decide in Scotland that it was essential that we should have exclusive 100% control over the future of the National Health Service in Scotland? Because that's what we've got today as a consequence of devolution. We have control to decide what type of National Health Service we want, what direction we want it to take, what reforms we want it to undertake. And by virtue of what we've decided to do in Scotland, we have expressly decided not to go down the route of fragmentation and competition, which is the route being pursued by the United Kingdom government. And what that begs for me the question is, if we believe that despite the fact that we've had a shared, if Mr Rennie will forgive me, I'll finish my argument here, if we have a shared heritage in building up an institution as fundamentally significant to every one of us as the National Health Service, and then we decide in 1997 as a people that we should exercise 100% control in Scotland democratically on our terms about the future of the National Health Service, why should we not exercise that control over other issues of significance to the future of our country?
Willie Rennie.
I mean, the Finance Secretary seems to be indicating that everything either has to be centralised or independent. We believe that actually there is a beauty in devolution, that people closest to the ground can make decisions where it's appropriate, but we can also share in the benefits of the United Kingdom. All the things that he is arguing should continue, like the currency, the energy market and all the other great things of the UK. Surely it's him that's contradicting himself.
John Swinney. It's not, because I'm going to come on to talk about a couple of the fundamental other major issues that I think we should be able to determine that are of great importance to people and the choices that we make. I want us to be able to make different choices about the defence expenditure that we undertake. I do not want this country to be associated with investing in the next generation of Trident nuclear missiles. I want to take a different course of action to the United Kingdom, and I believe that to be important, because I would rather spend the money that we are proposing, that's proposed to be spent on Trident nuclear missiles as part of the defence budget of the United Kingdom, I would rather spend that on measures that will tackle the long-term intergenerational inequality that has persisted throughout my entire lifetime in Scotland and transform the economic prospects of our people. That's a choice that I think is important for the people of Scotland, but today we cannot take it democratically in Scotland because the power rests within the United Kingdom government. Of course I will, yes.
Malcolm Chisholm.
The White Paper says all that money should also be spent on alternative defence expenditure, but isn't the real answer to his supposed contradiction that we want the best of both worlds? Will he not acknowledge any benefits that we get from being a member of the United Kingdom?
John Swinney.
I'm sorry, I don't know what's happened to Malcolm Chisholm. I used to listen to Malcolm Chisholm telling us about the importance of getting our priorities right, about the choices that we made. I cannot believe that Malcolm Chisholm would put a higher premium on Trident expenditure than tackling the fundamental inequality that exists in our country. And as a matter of white paper fact, we indicate in the white paper we would spend less on defence expenditure that is currently allocated to Scotland to the tune of £500 million as a consequence of that. Second issue that is of importance is the bedroom tax. This Parliament, by 108 votes to 15, voted for my 7th budget back in February. The issue that brought the Labour Party together with the Liberals, the Greens, the Independents and my own colleagues, not the Conservatives, was the issue of the bedroom tax and the money that we were prepared to put in there to mitigate the effects of the bedroom tax within Scotland. That is a welfare policy which clearly has a different democratic attitude and intent here in Scotland, and we should be able to exercise that over the whole area of issues in relation to welfare expenditure. I will give way to Mr
Johnson.
In her opening remarks, the Deputy First Minister appeared to make a £6 billion spending commitment. Will the Minister, before he ends his remarks, tell us what that meant and what that will cost in terms of additional taxation?
Your remaining 40 seconds.
Well, what the Deputy First Minister was saying was that the Conservative and Liberal government was making £6 billion worth of cuts to the welfare expenditure in the United Kingdom affecting Scotland, and people should be aware of the attitude and moral values of the Conservative government as a consequence of all of that. Now, Mr Rowley said in his contribution that he had a different vision to David Cameron. And I quite understand that, Mr. I totally accept that. But Mr Rowley seems to be prepared, as everybody else in the Better Together campaign accepts, is for Mr Cameron to be able to exercise political leadership over this country. I don't want the Tory choices to be inflicted on the people of Scotland. I want us to take our own decisions here in Scotland.
Many thanks. Now call on Jackson Carlo to wind up the debate. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Let me begin by returning the recent compliments of Nicola Sturgeon so graciously offered to me by saying that her performance today was, how can I put this, characteristically Ceausescu-esque in its abrasive combativeness and equally characteristically devoid of any verifiable substance. It was yet another depressingly empty litany of grievance and nationalist assertion. Assertions all of which, to borrow the SNP vernacular, are now rocks melting in the sun. Her amendment this afternoon, dear, articulates the most depressing and downcast vision for an independent Scotland that I've yet heard articulated. It positively relishes the prospect of a population wholly dependent on welfare handed down from an SNP government. It contains no entrepreneurial ambition for Scotland's economy or its people. Future generations can look forward to depleted oil revenues funding welfare, not to a modern expansionist economy creating jobs. It contains no ambition for Scotland's wider role in the world. It contains no ambition for wider cultural success. It just articulates a future of isolationist state dependency. Read it. And to make her democracy point this afternoon, well, Kevin Stewart retorted that 1979 was ancient history. But the amendment in Nicola Sturgeon's name chooses her own point of reference, 1945. And even then it can barely illustrate her position. Why not look at governments over, say, the last 100 years, which will show that her proposition was arguable in just 36 of the 100 years. And in any event, It is an argument any part of the United Kingdom could have made in the face of the outcome of different general elections across the last century. In England, for example, between 1964 and 66, or between 1974 and 1979, or between 2005 and 2010. It's an argument that could be made repeatedly in Wales, and it's an argument that could be made after each and every general election ever held in Northern Ireland. And yet all those countries and all those peoples understand that the strength that comes from pooling our resources and working in partnership with the most endurable and successful of unions. And in any event, it was precisely this imbalance that the devolved Scottish Parliament was established to address, a Parliament which confers on the Scottish Government powers which, for all the SNP and gripe and grievance, it declines to use. It could act on child payment now. It chooses not to. If the best the SNP can muster in support of an independent Scotland is some lurid anti-Tory or anti-Liberal Democrat rant, then do your worst. It may be the basis of an SNP party conference love-in performance with the Deputy First Minister, but it is hardly a basis on which to separate from the United Kingdom or to ask the people of Scotland to take a huge risk on a vulnerable new nation. Now, I thought Annabel Goldie set out the positive case for the United Kingdom in a masterful speech. She set out the broad range of positive interaction between Scotland and UK and the contribution achieved by Scotland with the rest of the UK together on the economic, on the international, on the defence sphere. Several members said there was no practical illustration of Scotland influencing the UK internationally. Well, let me give you one. In last year's Syria crisis, Scotland was deeply influential. In the House of Commons vote on military action, the decision not to proceed militarily was taken by a majority of just 13. That majority of 13 votes in the House of Commons included the votes of 45 Scottish MPs who voted no. Scotland influenced the outcome of the United Kingdom on Syria. And because Scotland influenced the outcome of the United Kingdom of Syria, the House, the Senate and the Congress of the United States paused and altered their policy too. Any vote in an independent Scotland could have changed nothing. The votes of Scots at Westminster changed the response of the Western world. Well, it's an irrefutable fact. It was the 45 votes of Scottish MPs that affected the outcome of that vote. And Nicola Sturgeon's response to all of this was to say that she would rather end child poverty than have a seat in the United Nations. And yet it is precisely that seat in the United Nations that allows the United Kingdom to influence policies that have an influence on child poverty across the world. With independence, we would neither influence child poverty, nor would we influence affairs in the rest of the world, nor would we have a secure economy or a strong economy to do either. I thought Drew Smith made a powerful, focused and measured speech which talked directly to the issues. Willie Rennie demonstrated the SNP welfare case. He made the point that 98% of the reforms that have been implemented are to be accepted by the SNP. And I recall Nicola Sturgeon coming to the Health Committee at the beginning of this Parliament saying, "I fully support the principles of welfare reform." And now we understand why, because she intends to implement 98% of them. What she is shamelessly doing is using the fears of many on welfare changes to market her agenda on independence with no intention of matching her words with financial commitments, as I think Gavin Brown ably demonstrated in challenging the government to say which of the welfare reforms they would actually finance differently. And then, of course, I think also the SNP front bench went quiet and speechless when Willie Rennie was able to quote the conclusions of the report that Nicola Sturgeon had cited by Professor Leslie Young. Malcolm Chisholm understands what the SNP do not, that this referendum is a vote on the consequences of which will outlast this, any and all future Conservative governments. It was a devastating critique from him of the economic experts giving evidence to this Parliament. In this long, seemingly never-ending referendum battle, we may not be at the end, but neither, as we was once said, at the end of the beginning. We are at the beginning of the end. In a speech to the House of Commons on independence almost 25 years ago to the day, Alex Salmond boasted that opinion polls showed that his cause was on the march. Indeed, quite carried away by the occasion 25 years ago as he was, he added a characteristic flourish, saying that opinion polls revealed that 62% of Scots were at that time in favour of independence in Europe. Oh dear. From such giddy heights, the opinion poll facts for a generation since have demonstrated one clear and opposite truth. The majority of Scots, the silent majority of Scots, if you will, remain committed to a Scotland within the United Kingdom. The silent majority of ordinary Scots, the silent majority of Scottish students in votes in Strathclyde, in Glasgow and at Glasgow Caledonian, the silent majority of first-time voters in votes in schools in Aberdeenshire or in the last month at Milburn Academy, in the Orkney High Schools, at Forest Academy, at Kinlochleven, at Hazelhead Academy, at Harlow Academy, at Ross High and at Craigmount High. The silent majority of men, of women, of trade unionists, of nurses and other workers in our public services, or workers in the shipyards in the Clyde, of employees of independently owned retail and manufacturing companies across Scotland, companies like Clyde Blowers, whatever their Monaco-based bosses may think. Instead of purring with delight over Kremlin approval of Alex Salmond, the silent majority of Scots would rather purr with satisfaction, standing tall in a United Kingdom, standing tall for its values articulated by Annabel Goldie earlier, not the values of a former Soviet apparatchik, for the tried, tested and consistent values of a union that stood firmly for democratic change across the continent that Mr Salmond's favourite apparatchik once mastered. The silent majority who will have the confidence to firmly stare down the boggle-eyed, messianic, evangelical door-knockers who regularly cast their bile on the United Kingdom and all it has achieved. Whatever their individual political allegiances or inclinations, the silent majority of Scots who believe that this union is equally our union, who can vote for Scotland uniquely, to be the only nation in that union to have voted to be there, for a Scotland standing taller, more confident and ready to embrace further the devolved responsibility which all those political parties opposing independence are committed to delivering. And that's a commitment that was questioned, but which has been given by both Ed Miliband and by the Prime Minister. The one thing this constitutional debate has sparked is an acceptance and a desire for more devolved powers for this Scottish Parliament when we vote no in September. The silent majority making a positive affirmation of our confidence, our willingness to progress, not just as an enlightened and better Scotland, but as an even better Scotland still, a Scotland in partnership with and at the heart of the United Kingdom.
Order. Wished. That concludes the debate on Scotland's future. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 9853 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9853.
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. No member is asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 9853, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 9854, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for Stage 2 of the Defective and Dangerous Buildings Recovery of Expenses Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion, press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9854.
Moved.
Thank you. No members asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 9854, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of two Parliamentary Bureau motions. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9855 on approval of an SSI and motion number 9856 on deadlines for lodging First Minister's questions and portfolio general and topical questions.
Moved.
Questions of these motions will come at decision time, to which we now come. There are 5 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that in relation to the debate on Scotland's future, if the amendment in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is agreed, the amendment in the name of Drew Smith falls. The first question then is amendment number 9844.3 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, which seeks to amend motion number 9844 in the name of Annabel Goldie on Scotland's future, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 9844.3 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 53. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to and the amendment in the name of Drew Smith falls. The next question is that motion number 9844 in the name of Annabel Goldie as amended on Scotland's future be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 9844 in the name of Annabel Goldie as amended is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 53. There were no abstentions. Therefore, the motion as amended is agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9855 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9856 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on deadlines for lodging First Minister's questions and portfolio, general and topical questions be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.